So, Charles Habib Malik is one of the most important Arab Christians of the 20th century. He was born on the 11th of February, 1906, in Batarram, a town located in what is now northern Lebanon. When he was still a boy, a natural disaster and political upheaval caused by World War I created widespread famine in the region. Historians estimate that between 100,000 and 200,000 people in his area would have died of starvation. So that's roughly a third to a half of the population. But Charles survived, and even though he was raised in an Eastern Orthodox family, he would complete his secondary education at the Protestant American Mission School for Boys in Tripoli. It was an organization that also welcomed Maronites, which is the Roman Catholic Church in Lebanon, as well as Sunni Muslims. And Charles had a brilliant mind, and after studying maths and physics at the American University of Beirut, he went on to study under two of the greatest living philosophers of his time, Alfred North Whitehead, who was at Harvard, and Martin Heidegger in Germany. And he was in Germany actually during the rise of National Socialism, and one sadly remarkable story from this time is that he ended up being beaten pretty severely by an SS officer who mistook him for being Jewish. And the scars would remain on his body for decades. And perhaps unsurprisingly, he left Germany relatively quickly after that happened. So after finishing his PhD, Charles worked for the American University of Beirut for a couple years before being asked to be Lebanon's first ambassador to the United States, as well as the Lebanese delegate to the United Nations. And during that time, he served on the committee that drafted the UN Declaration for Human Rights. And it was under the influence of his Christian faith that Malik insisted that human rights be thought about in terms of natural law, meaning that human rights are given in the very nature of things, rather than, say, as a gift of human governments. And this insistence is reflected in the Declaration's preamble, which he was responsible for drafting. The part of Charles's story that's most interesting to me, though, comes towards the ends of his life, when he was invited to open the Billy Graham Center in Wheaton, Illinois. Charles's speech from this ceremony was called The Two Tasks. And in this speech, Charles starts by expressing his appreciation for evangelicals and their Protestant legacy, saying that they've reminded other Christians about the supreme importance of the Bible, of a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, of justification by faith and not by works, and responsible freedom as the essence of human dignity. But he goes on to challenge evangelicals in America with two tasks. And the first of those tasks, he says, is that evangelicals need to recover the riches of Christian history. There are those, he chides, who act like God has not done anything in history between the Apostle Paul and Billy Graham. And I quote him here, "Jesus Christ, who is the light of the world, will not be revealed as such, and his wonderful light will not shine in the awful darkness of our world, until American evangelicals, upon whom much depend, integrate themselves into the unity and continuity of the cumulative Christian tradition. He has shone on many a soul and many a culture in the past, and not only on the evangelicals of today." And it was on this basis that he would encourage evangelicals to read Ignatius of Antioch, John Chrysostom, Basil the Great, Ephraim the Syrian, Augustine of Hippo, Thomas Aquinas, and Teresa of Avila. So recovering church history was Malik's first task for American evangelicals. His second task to them was to recover the life of the mind. And I quote him again here, "This is a solemn occasion. I must be frank with you. The greatest danger besetting American evangelical Christianity is the danger of anti-intellectualism. Who among evangelicals can stand up to the great secular or naturalistic or atheistic scholars on their own terms of scholarship and research? Who among evangelical scholars is quoted as a normative source by the greatest secular authorities on history or philosophy or psychology or sociology or politics? Does your mode of thinking have the slightest chance of becoming the dominant mode of thinking in the greatest universities of Europe and America, which stamp your entire civilization with their own spirit and ideas?" Now, the reason I find this speech so significant is not only because I think it was very prophetic, written in 1980, but also because it didn't fall on deaf ears. So 14 years later, the American evangelical Mark Knoll would write a book called The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. And he would cite Malik's speech at the beginning of that book as one of the best analyses of the problem facing the evangelical church. And that book had a wide impact in evangelical circles, not least of all upon a young preacher named Tim Keller, who many know now as the late Presbyterian pastor who wrote The Reason for God and many other books, which would have a big impact on evangelicals and encourage them to engage with the life of the mind. So I'm personally indebted to Charles for inspiring a generation of academically engaged evangelicals.
Welcome back to the Overtones podcast. I'm Christy Wong, and I'm here today with my co-hosts LaRae and Joe.
Hi guys.
Hello there. If you're new to the podcast, our goal is to investigate and celebrate the diverse unity of the Christian church around the world.
That's right. We speak to academics, church workers, and lay people from across the global church in order to highlight lesser heard voices and grow in love for our brothers and sisters around the world.
Today, we're delighted to have with us on our podcast Joseph, an American academic who's here to help us think about all things pertaining to Christianity and the Middle East. Welcome, Joseph.
Thanks, Christy.
Yes, welcome.
Thanks, LaRae. It's great to be with you all.
All right, Joseph, you are an American and a Christian and deeply interested in the church in the Middle East. So where did this interest originally come from?
Sure. My own interest in the Middle East began in childhood. So I was 10 years old when 9/11 occurred, and that put the Middle East on my radar. And being a nerdy child, I wanted to find out about what had happened and where these people were coming from who had attacked America. And so I started reading more about Afghanistan, and then due to the American invasion of Iraq, about Iraq as well. And that interest continued throughout my schooling. My teachers saw my interest and rewarded me with opportunities to combine my school studies with projects that looked at the Middle East. And lo and behold, when it came time to choose an undergraduate degree, it just so happened that the university in my home state, which was much cheaper than going anywhere else, offered a degree in Middle Eastern studies. So I went and visited and had a very good experience there, and turned out to have an aptitude for language. So I was able to learn Arabic there, traveled to the Middle East a few times during undergrad as part of that Arabic learning experience. And then when I finished my undergraduate degree, I moved to the Middle East for about 6 months to continue improving my Arabic. Yeah, so I would say that, to sum it up, it's a bit of a providential mix and match, that interest and aptitude and opportunity kind of all aligned time and time again.
I see. Oh, fascinating. Very often, the idea of the Middle East and Israel, these are buzzwords in America and in the UK and, and a lot of other places as well. So how do we kind of unpack the idea of the Middle East?
Yeah, I guess the first time I thought about the term Middle East was during my undergraduate studies, when my professor pointed out that it is what we would call a Eurocentric term. The term Middle East is relative. Middle East of what? Well, it's Middle East relative to Europe. He said if we were going to be completely objective in the way we described it, it would probably be called Southwest Asia and North Africa or something like that, which is fine. There's nothing problematic about the term Middle East in itself. You just need to be aware of where it's come from. Some people also expand that really to say Middle East and North Africa and use the acronym MENA to talk about that, just as a way of, again, recognizing that we are talking about places that are relatively diverse geographically. They span several thousand miles, and though they are linked by certain connections of religion and history, they also have some of their own locality as well.
MENA sounds like a great term.
Yeah, that's one I often use.
So Joseph, you don't currently live in the Middle East, but as you've alluded to already, you've spent quite a bit of time there at various points. What's it like being a Christian in the Middle East? And maybe that's too broad of a question. Are there differences more locally, being a Christian in Egypt versus Lebanon versus Saudi Arabia? What would be your reflections on that?
Yeah, the second part of your question, LaRae, I think gets to the heart of the issue, which is that it would be very difficult to describe just one common generic experience for Christians there. It does vary from place to place, and I suppose you could describe it as being on a spectrum. So there are some places in the Middle East where no public expression of Christianity is permitted, meaning that the governments don't allow land to churches of any kind. There's no visible signs of Christianity. Saudi Arabia would be a good example of that. I'm not aware as yet. Now, I should qualify this all by saying that things change sometimes very fast. And Saudi Arabia is very quickly opening up to the West in pretty unprecedented ways, to tourism and other things.
Sure.
So it may not be long before we see some kind of formal tolerance there. But historically, at least, Saudi Arabia was an example of a place that no churches were allowed, even for expatriates who are living there.
Wow.
You might find a church or a chapel on a U.S. military base. I can imagine that would be the case. But nowhere on civilian lands would you find that. One step over from that, you would have countries that allow certain forms of public expression for Christianity for international people, non-Arabs and non-Muslims. So places that would allow this would be, for instance, the United Arab Emirates, the Sultanate of Oman, Morocco. Mm-hmm. These are all places that don't have indigenous Christian populations. At least they don't admit that they have any. But they do acknowledge that they have large expatriate populations, and they allow churches to be there, Roman Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, and you can attend those without any problem. And the government will provide security and other things for them. They are legally allowed. But evangelism would not be allowed in those contexts. And if you were caught doing that, you would be deported pretty quickly.
Sure.
One step further over on the spectrum are countries that allow public expressions for foreigners, and they also recognize indigenous Christian communities that have been there since before the advent of Islam. So these would be countries like Egypt, right, Palestine, Syria, Iraq. And this is a group of people that many American Christians, perhaps, and European Christians are not aware of as existing, that Christianity in the Middle East did not stop when Islam conquered the region. In some places, Christians remained demographic majority for several hundred more years.
Wow. Yeah.
And so today, for instance, now I should say these demographics, again, are pretty rapidly changing.
Sure.
And they have changed rapidly, not least of all because of the war in Syria, the war in Iraq. But historically, Iraq had anywhere up to about 30% of its population was Christian, I believe.
Wow.
Similar numbers for Syria, I think. And Egypt was about 15%.
And how long ago would that be?
This would have been up until, say, 2000, the year 2000.
Right. That's the kind of statistic I think I've read somewhere as well.
Yeah.
And I was surprised because I think the kind of Christian populations are, and then proportionally, just consistently higher than, let's say, countries in East Asia. But people don't know about that.
Yeah, you're right. So Egypt would have had about 10% of their population still. Now, those numbers in Syria and Iraq especially have depleted really drastically due to the wars.
I'm sure.
Egypt remains relatively stable at about 10%, so they say. And so what you find here, again, is a recognition within the Constitution somehow that acknowledges these people's existence. Historically, they would have been governed under Islamic law, or at least subject to it finally. They would have had a place within Islamic law called the dhimmi status, which means protected status. So it was a way of giving them a legal existence that admittedly was second class, so they didn't have all the privileges that their Muslim counterparts would, but it was legal protection. And there are instances, we see evidence from history of Christians being able, in the most extreme circumstances, to be able to prosecute wrongdoing by Muslims against them in Islamic courts of law.
Wow.
That does happen. And then one step over from that, you have a very few countries which allow pretty much unlimited freedom of religion within their constitution. Lebanon is the prime example. Tunisia, after the Arab Spring, I think they aspired to being also a bit more free about these things. But in Lebanon, I know for sure that you can become a Christian from a Muslim background, and legally that will not be a problem for you.
Wow.
So I attended a church on Easter Sunday several years ago and was surprised to find that over half of the congregation that day were from a Syrian Muslim background.
Wow. That's amazing.
So that's a rare instance of how things are working there. But that would be the spectrum of from no public expression to full public expression, including the right to evangelize and change your mind on religious issues. And most fall somewhere in the middle.
Mm-hmm. Sure. And has your experience visiting those places, have you mostly been in the countries that are kind of in the middle in terms of...
Yeah, I should say I haven't been everywhere. I haven't been everywhere in the Middle East. I've only been...
Sure.
I've been to Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, Oman, and Morocco, I think are the ones I've been to so far.
Okay.
So
sure.
I have some experience in those areas, and the experience of being a Christian differs culturally in each of those places as well.
Sure.
Depending on whether you've got a long-term indigenous group or whether the church is solely expatriates or expatriates and local believers who are living in hiding or in secrecy, as it were. All of those things affect it. I would suppose as well, one other I've talked kind of politically and legally about the situation. Culturally, there's some important things to note about Christianity there too, which is that the historic expressions of Christianity in these regions are very ancient, and they have a much longer history than the history of the church in America.
Sure.
So you've got, on the one hand, you've got very old traditions, and you've got very different traditions from one another. So you have churches which didn't agree, for instance, with the Council of Chalcedon or the Council of Ephesus, I believe, which comes after that. And so you have not only Eastern Orthodox Christians, but you have groups which would be called the Miaphysite Church, the Coptic Church, which doesn't believe that Christ has two natures, but only one nature. You have some churches which would be called Nestorian in the West, meaning that they also don't have a Western definition of who Christ was. And so you have these different communities within there. All of them would be very different from your typical evangelical church. They would be much longer services on the one hand, several hours at a time often.
What do they do?
Much more liturgically focused. I mean, you'd recognize the elements that are there. They're liturgically focused. There's, of course, singing of hymns, reading of God's word, and the participation in the sacraments. But this takes a long time, and the sacramental movements which draw these things out can last for hours on end.
Hours.
Yeah, definitely. And often you get people coming in and coming out of the service for periods of time as they're able to attend. And there's also, I would say in general, there is let's call it for lack of a better word, a stronger theology of space, more akin to perhaps Roman Catholic teaching. They look to the book of Acts and see that people were longing to touch the robes of Peter, for instance, that they might be healed. And they derive from those biblical teachings the theology that holy people can have special power sometimes from God to do things. And so items attaching to holy people or places attaching to holy events have an almost mystical religious significance to them. And just being in that place can sometimes be considered to be having a positive effect. So you have that kind of devotion to a material religion, you might say, a very embodied religion, in a way that sometimes isn't present in the West, or at least not in Protestant Western Christianity.
Right. Yeah, the only thing that I can kind of think of would be some kind of a logical similarity to kind of variants of charismatic Christianity, but it will still be very different.
It's sounding very familiar to me. My father-in-law was raised in the Syrian Orthodox Church in southern India, and the stories he tells of communion services that last 3 hours, and it's very interesting. I think it's so helpful as an American Christian to simply be aware of these cultures where the Reformation never happened and what that kind of looks like. And I wonder, do you think the fact that the church in the Middle East and some of these other places isn't Protestant, do you think that contributes to the misunderstandings that American evangelicals have about Christianity even kind of being present in the region? Do you think that has something to do with it?
Definitely. And the problem goes back even earlier than Protestantism. So there have been a lot of self-inflicted wounds, East versus West, in history. One of the crusading armies sent to assist Christians in the East ended up sacking Constantinople instead of attacking Muslims. So that has been there for a long time. Fast forward to the 19th century and the 20th century, when you get Protestant missionaries going to Muslim-majority countries, they often find that converting Muslims is very hard work, and there's no real appetite for it. And they end up converting Christians instead to a more Western Protestant form of Christianity.
Interesting.
And that often ended up creating quite tense relations in the 20th century between Protestant churches and Eastern churches.
Sure.
Because the Protestant churches were regarded as kind of flock stealers. And there was kind of perceived to be a hubris about the way that this was done, as though without making any attempt to properly understand where these traditions came from or why they existed, they were dismissed out of hand.
That's so interesting.
Thanks so much, Joseph. It's really interesting in hearing the real kind of differences in how church is done across the world. And so I was wondering, what other things do you think more Western Christians misunderstand about the church in the Middle East, from what you've seen whilst there, but also what you've seen through history too?
I think probably we have to back up even before we ask what Western Christians misunderstand about the church in the Middle East. That question presumes we understand something, when often, in fact, Christians in the West are not aware that Christians still live in the Middle East and
Right.
lived there for 600 years before Islam even came. Often in school we learn that, the Middle East became Islamic around 600, 700 AD, and that's just how it's been since then. But these Christian communities continue to exist and endure under Islamic rule, often making some really vital contributions to even the promotion of the West later. So just as an example, Christians living under Islamic rule in the Abbasid Caliphate, so the second major Islamic civilization, they were responsible for helping translate Aristotle's works from Greek into Arabic
Really?
and making them accessible to the Arab world. And it was then from the Arab world that the West rediscovered Aristotle in the 12th and 13th centuries via Muslim philosophers living in Spain and North Africa.
Right.
And that then leads to its own kind of renaissance in the West, whether for good or for ill. Whether Aristotle's reincorporation into Western theology is a good or a bad thing, we can debate that, but it at least had a major impact.
Certainly.
And similarly, they had an outsized influence in the shape of politics in the 20th century. People don't often know that one of the premier intellectual forces behind the Ba'ath Party which continues to rule in Syria under Bashar al-Assad, and which was in power in Iraq under Saddam Hussein. The word Ba'ath means resurrection.
What?
And one of the prime movers of this intellectual movement was a man named Michel Aflaq, who was from an Arab Christian family.
Wow.
And what they had hoped would happen with the invention of these ideologies is that a way of living together politically would come to be, which didn't put Muslims on the first class and Christians in the second class space. They wanted some kind of even footing. So that's where these Christians got involved in the political ideologies of their time. Now, I think there's some big problems with those ideologies, and we can talk about them if you want. But nonetheless, Christians were very involved. And of course, my opening story related to you the big events in Charles Malik's life. Charles Malik is a Lebanese Eastern Orthodox Christian who is responsible for the UN Declaration of Human Rights preamble and much of the content that goes in it. So there continue to be ways in which Middle East Christians are having an influence on the world stage, but they're largely unknown by Western Christians.
That is so important to hear.
If I can just add one thing into this,
Go for it.
I wanted to share a story about the misconception about Islam.
Go for it. Yes, I love that.
So I think one thing that is often assumed in the West is that some kind of militant response or strong-handed response is needed against Islam in order to deal effectively with it. And that can take the weak form of just being tough on immigration and not letting Muslims come here, or it can be quite strong-handed of, we need to pursue through military policy the elimination, for instance, of terrorism. So we have the war on terror, was part of George W. Bush's policy. One very interesting thing that gets proposed very early on in Christian approaches to Islam is that Islam is actually not a separate religion, but a Christian heresy. And not only a Christian heresy, but a heresy that arises specifically because of Christian disunity. So you find people such as John Wycliffe, for instance, in the 14th century in Europe, saying that the real problem, the real us versus them in the world, is not Western Christendom versus Arab Islamic lands. It's actually the spirit of Christianity and the spirit of Islam, which are against each other. And the spirit of Islam, he says, is the spirit of Roman Catholicism in the 14th century.
Whoa!
So everything he says...
John Wycliffe?
That's right, John Wycliffe is saying
But
this.
Roman Catholicism wasn't a concept then.
He was saying the church in Rome.
Okay.
The church in Rome has succumbed to the spirit of Islam.
Oh, fair enough. Okay, I see.
So that's what he's saying. And he says, what did Muhammad want? He wanted earthly possession, a territorial kingdom. Well, that's exactly what the Pope is aiming for right now. And he goes on, lists all these things that we say are kind of characteristic of Muhammad's biography. These are just, we need to look in the mirror and realize that these are exactly what the Roman Catholic Church, the church in the West, we should say, historically, Christy, at that point, has the Church of Rome. He would say the Church of Rome has transmorphed into this. And you might think, well, this is just name calling, right? But no, he says, actually, the real issue here, he thinks one crucial aspect of this is that fighting Muslims is folly. Right? Fighting is just one more manifestation of that spirit that is antithetical to Christianity. He says if we really want Islam to diminish, we need to heal the divisions within Christianity itself. He's looking to the sectarian divisions in his own society, not least of all the division of secular and ordained person, and the division of the religious orders into dozens of different monastic communities that are often at war with one another in kind of petty little ways. And he's saying, look, this is just, until we can find a way to overcome these problems, Islam is never going to go away. And I think that that's a pretty fair way to look at it. In the Old Testament, for instance, we see that when Rehoboam begins to treat his brothers unjustly, God's punishment is to divide the kingdom from Israel. And we could say, for instance, that it's not inconceivable to think about Islam providentially as a religion which arises in response to Christian disunity. And indeed, the Quran actually notes all the divisions within Christianity and admonishes Muslims not to be like that. So in a way, we have to say the only way we can really have Islam go away is to prove the Quran untrue by reforming ourselves. I think that's a fair way to put it.
Yeah. Very, very profound. I think that was so profound because instead of looking out and catching the so-called religious other, I think Christians really have to kind of sort of look within and see the type of language and concepts and worldviews we are spreading and the tensions that we are creating. And there are a lot of things to repent for as a church.
Yeah, removing the log of division from our own eye before we remove the speck from our Muslim brother's eye.
So, Joseph, what does it look like to do good as God's chosen people in exile in a different country? What does it look like for them to live as a Christian in those areas, to do evangelism with lots of different pressures and lots of different issues like the ones we just covered?
Well, lots of Christians are finding, because of the major political upheavals which have happened in what's called the Levant area, meaning Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, they're finding hospitality is a major part of their witness and being willing to welcome people in the name of Christ, not in just kind of a live and let live way, but of course sharing the good news as you welcome them and welcoming them in Jesus' name. That's been a major issue for those Christians, I think, who want to take that up. In other places, you'll see a lot of evangelism happening online as a first point of contact. And it's probably worth canvassing as well some of the deeper problems surrounding evangelism historically. So when Muslims conquered these Christian regions, they offered Christians the right to continue living under their rule in a particular way. They made them sign covenants, and these covenants had stipulations. One of these stipulations was that you were not allowed to evangelize anymore. So you could still live, you could still worship in your own buildings, you could still pass your faith along to your children, but you weren't allowed to try and convince anyone outside your family who wasn't already a Christian that Christianity was true. So what really happens then is, in some sense, I think Christianity devolves out of being a religion focused on truth to being a kind of human tradition. Or at the very least, we might say just a private truth. It's a truth for me and my family, but it's not a truth for the whole world, because if we try and make it a truth for everyone, then that will lead to problems for us. So you pretty quickly get a lot of quietism on that front. You do get, within the history of the church in the Middle East, you have people who are martyred for sharing their faith. You also have a lot of resentment towards Muslim rulers who often rule fairly, sometimes more justly than Christians, but also, like any political rulers, they're imperfect and they sometimes rule unjustly. Sure. And so Christians have resentment against Muslims for that. So not only do you have legal, but you also have some social forces disinclining people from sharing this news. Thirdly, in the rise of the 20th century, with the rise of state-centric governments, which were very autocratic and very surveillance-based, you would often get people from the government monitoring churches to make sure that they were not evangelizing. And one of the ways they might do this is by setting up a false flag operation, where you send someone to the church who says, "Hello, I'm Mr. So-and-so, and I'm interested in becoming a Christian." And if the church expresses an interest in helping guide this person to the truth, well, then they have a pretense for closing it down. So on top of these forces, you get some suspicion. All that means that today, basically, there are some major obstacles in most countries to open and straightforward evangelism: legal, social, historical. And it means that often, let's say somebody does hear about Christ online or from some impersonal or indirectly personal source. If they approach a Christian friend, one response you might get is, well, you need to just explore these things on your own and don't involve us because this will be dangerous for us. A second thing that might happen is they say, well, okay, we're willing to help you, but you need to go worship in a church that is secret and designed especially for Muslim background believers. You can't join our church here, the public one.
Wow.
Because, again, we can't be seen to be having someone here who's named. And people would know right away from your name whether you're a Muslim or a Christian, because
Sure.
they have religious overtones, names do often. And then even if you had a church that was willing to go that step and say, okay, well, we're willing to let you come in and worship here, then you have to imagine what happens when that person, say, falls in love with the daughter of a Christian man. Now you've got another problem of a legal issue. If they do get married, according to the state, their children will be legally Muslim. And so you'd get a massive hesitancy, at least, on the part of Christian families to allow Muslim background believers to kind of fully integrate into the ethnically Christian society because of these legal and social barriers. And for all intents and purposes, if they did decide that they were willing to let it go forward, that couple would have to look at emigrating to a country that would allow them to live more freely than they are able to there.
Right.
So those are some of the barriers. All that being said, there are many groups that are very courageously speaking the truth online, in person, trying to be innovative and creative in how they create social communities which can incorporate Muslim background believers into the public visible church. I won't go into details there about any particular place, obviously for security reasons, but I would say it's a major challenge for the 21st century, thinking about how to allow Muslim background believers to be a full part of the visible church
Right.
in circumstances where there are major obstacles to that.
Well, so costly being a Christian. And you see that these people are doing these things because they love the Lord and they love the people around them. Thanks for sharing.
It's really challenging. Yeah, thank you.
Joseph, thanks so much. I think it's so encouraging hearing Christians, especially in the Middle East, suffering for doing good. Just like 1 Peter reminds those Christians kind of displaced, waiting for Jesus to return to do good, to mirror Jesus' pattern of suffering now, glory later, and to bring glory to God through others, and seeing their good deeds and glorifying God on the day that he returns. So obviously 1 Peter has lots of encouragements for those suffering for doing good, but how can we be supporting Christians, especially in the Middle East? How can we be praying for them currently?
Well, happily, there are a lot of organizations which can keep you up to date on what to pray for. There's one well-known one called Open Doors, which has offices, I think, around the world. And they provide a map every year of the top places in the world which persecute Christians and the kinds of challenges they're facing. I think they probably produce monthly prayer letters as well. So that would be a good place to get ongoing information if you're interested. I would say, ultimately, the prayer for the church there is the prayer that the church here needs and the church everywhere. Jesus prayed that the church would be one, even as he and the Father are one. And as one theologian puts it, Jesus always gets what he asks for.
Yes.
So we need to pray for that. The church in the Middle East, one of the reasons that it's been historically weak is because it's been divided. Monophysites from diaphysites, Nestorians from Chalcedonians, the list goes on. And you have a history of these groups fighting against each other, and Protestants now join the fray, as it were, of churches. We need a truly Catholic church, not in the sense of Roman Catholic, but in the Greek sense of that word, meaning universal. We want the church to support and grow closer, not at the expense of truth, not in a willy-nilly way, but doing the hard work of sitting down together, of learning from one another, of growing together in Christ. So praying for unity is a big part. Praying for boldness, I think, as Joe hinted, is also a big prayer. The church has often been tempted, practically, to deny the resurrection.
Yes.
And to deny the ascension. So the resurrection, practically, is our guarantee that this life is not all there is. And that is what guarantees that if we suffer in this life, that suffering will be rewarded with glory later. And when Christians began signing up to these covenants which prohibit evangelism, what you in effect get is a denial of the resurrection and a return to what Paul calls life under the flesh, with all of its fears and envies and rivalries and dissensions. So when the believers in Acts pray for boldness, in Acts chapter 4, they quote Psalm 2, which is a psalm which speaks about Christ's ascension over the rulers of the earth and the surety of his gaining possession there. That's what we need to keep in mind. And that's what believers everywhere in the world need to be encouraged by when they face really what feels like insurmountable obstacles to sharing their faith. Only if Jesus has triumphed over every unjust government and every unjust social structure which prohibits the truth from spreading can we feel the power and empowered to disobey those authorities when obedience to Christ demands it.
Well put.
Very well said. Very encouraging.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you so much for coming on today. You've given me so much to think about. I'm sure our audience will feel the same. It's so helpful to recognize how limited one's perspective can be and to hear the real stories of real people living in a very different part of the world from where I am, but who are in many ways very similar to me, just wanting to live the Christian life in a faithful way in the context that the Lord has allowed us to be placed. And you've really inspired my prayers for the MENA region, for you, of course, as well, as you continue your work. Thank you again for coming on the Overtones podcast, and thank you to our listeners for joining us today. We will look forward to being in your ears again next week.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning into the Overtones podcast today. Make sure to subscribe and tune in to the next episode on your streaming platform of choice.
Follow us and share our podcast with your friends on Facebook and Instagram. You can find us on both platforms as Overtones Think Tank.
And if you'd like to get in touch with feedback, comments, or other ideas, our email address is podcast@overtonesproject.com. See you next week.